In this video, we will discuss voice as process, as giving an account of oneself. In Nick Coldry's book, Why Voice Matters, he asserts some 5 basic principles which capture what is distinctive about voice as process. The first principle is that voice is socially grounded. So when we say this, we're saying that voice is social by nature. That as human beings, we are co-constructing our voices together, and that it develops over time through relationships with other people around us. Now, voice depends on prior conditions in order to exist. So one of these would be shared resources of material of life, meaning our basic physiology, right? Not all human beings have the capacity to speak. Some people are born mute, or some people have their vocal cords damaged at some point in time over the course of their lives. And so a basic fundamental part of this would be physiological access to voice. Although in the digital age, we don't always need that physical form to have a voice, right? Now we can share things through the written word, through the creation of memes, through many digital contexts. So other resources of material life would be things like access to a computer, or access to the internet, or access to a pencil and paper, ways to construct voice. The other prior condition that must exist would involve social resources. So in this sense, this is where we're talking about a shared language that enable and sustain practices of narration, or the creation of narratives. So in this sense, it would be like in our class, our primary language is English. So when I teach, you understand the words that are coming out of my mouth because we share a common language between each other. Voice as being socially grounded also requires resources. So these might be practical resources, again in terms of language, but also in the construction of social norms. So for example, a social norm around voice might be that we can't use our voice to scream fire into a crowded building because that would be hazardous to other people and is against the law in our country. Another resource would be symbolic status. And so this is where we're really getting into sort of the power dynamics behind this theory of voice, looking at who has the power to use their voice in our society, whereas their voice is perceived by others as having status, as having power, as having influence. And we know that status, symbolic status, is not given equally to every member of our society. Lastly, voice is part of an ongoing exchange of narratives with others. So like I was alluding to a few minutes ago, that we co-construct our realities together. I have a voice because it's been bounced off of other human beings' brains, and the way they perceive my voice, the way they perceive my ideas, the way they perceive my perspective, and I'm shaping it and I'm shifting it through those interactions constantly over time. The second principle of voice's process is reflexive agency. So we'll start by just thinking about agency in and of itself. Agency involves taking responsibility for the stories we tell. Granted, though, in sort of civic media literature and civic engagement literature, particularly ever since even the works of John Dewey, there's been an inherent link between the value of voice and democracy as social cooperation. So in this sense, it's that we're using our voices to create social change or to change the world around us. So we have agency to create change in that sense. So with that in mind, reflexive agency is a personal, ongoing process that we hold within ourselves. Reflexive agency involves a personal, ongoing process of reflection and an exchange of narratives between our past and present selves and us versus others. So in this sense, it's a personal journey that we're constantly taking, but granted, sometimes this happens in the background or the subconscious of our minds. When we're reflexively analyzing these things, we're thinking about how we're constructing our voice in relation to other people. So for example, maybe you're sitting in a meeting at work one day and you blurt out an idea without really thinking it through. But after those words escape your mouth and people have responded to it, and then you go home and you think about the entire exchange, you start to rethink your position on the words that just came out of your mouth, right? So based off the feedback from other people, based on our own self-criticisms or our own self-doubt, we start to shift and reshape our narratives inside our heads. Maybe that's our perception of ourselves, maybe that's perceptions of others, of the world around us, but through the process of reflexive agency, it's the idea that we have the ability to engage with ourselves reflexively to better understand our voice and the impact of our voice on the world around us. Ultimately, human beings have a desire to narrate, a desire to make sense of our lives, and we do this through the reflexivity that's involved in this process. We do this through self-reflection, but constant self-reflection, ongoing self-reflection over time and with other people. The third principle in voice's process is that voice is an embodied process. So we each articulate the world from a distinctive embodied position and an embodied history. So this includes our voice in and of itself, a history of our reflection amongst ourselves and with others, as well as our own self-interpretation of who we are, how we see ourselves. All of this results from a relationship between voice and action. When we use our voice and engage in actions in the world around us, how does that help our voices to live in the world around us, as well as to engage with others in the world around us? This idea that voice is an embodied process is irreducibly plural. So what this means is that even if the resources on which each voice draws from are inherently social, the trajectory of each voice is distinct. So for example, we're all sharing a common language right now, and that's a social aspect of this. But individually, the trajectory of our own voices, the way we use them, the way they are shaped, the way they influence and change the world around us, that's a unique trajectory to each individual human. Voice as an embodied process also makes it inherently a social process. So this involves both speaking and listening. So voice isn't just the act of talking out loud. We don't just change minds by saying words out loud, right? We have to involve in a feedback loop here. We have to involve engaging with other people. So that also means listening. It's not just about speaking, but it's also about listening. And so there's an act of attention that registers the uniqueness of the other's narrative, and then how that in turn shapes and influences our own voice and narrative structure. And lastly, there's an internal diversity to our own voices. So we don't just have one story about our lives, right? We have a multitude of stories over the course of our lives, and each story is then reshaping our lived experiences and our own perception of the world around us. So there's an inherent internal plurality for each individual human being's voice. This encompasses processes where we can reflect from one narrative stream to another, and think about what one strand of our lives might mean for the other strand. So for example, if you have a very stressful day at work and that's occupying your mind in the construction of your own internal narrative, and you go home to maybe the peacefulness of your home life, that noise from your workday doesn't just stop the moment you enter the door, right? There's all of a sudden cognitive dissonance or a clash that's happening. So however that noise or that voice that's going on inside our head, when we enter that peaceful realm, we now have to sort of make a compromise as we navigate those two worldviews and those two different narrative streams. And how are they going to come together? Sometimes they clash, sometimes they don't, right? Sometimes we can weave one narrative seamlessly into the other as we go throughout our daily existence.